Hello, everyone. Welcome. You're all being super well behaved, sitting very quietly. So that's lovely in a studious mode for the first morning of Revo. Welcome to the session, What Consumers Want from Place in the Future. I'm Jessica Middleton-Pugh, editor of Place Northwest. So this session is themed around the never-changing and the ever-changing elements in our society and how they are impacting retail. As we've all heard a lot about, retail is not dead, but it is in a state of flux. But some aspects are never changing. We still have consumers, people are still spending at least some of their money, but are becoming more discerning about the quality of the experience around that money. We still have communities, and in tough times, those communities are clinging together tighter than ever. What is ever changing are the technological advances enabling people to have those experiences and the context in which they're having them. We're in a blended world. The ways we live, work, and socialize are all overlapping. And so the places in which we spend that time need to adapt accordingly. It's a very big topic that expands over just retail. So the kind sponsors of this session, CallisonRTKL, have brought together a great and diverse lineup of speakers to address it. And please get involved yourselves as well. It's not just all about us. We want to hear your thoughts. So later on in the session, there will be an opportunity for questions. And you can also get involved on Twitter using the hashtag CRTKL Thinkers. And to continue that blended theme, CallisonRTKL have also commissioned Scriberia, who are a live graphic illustrator who will be creating the words that we speak on the stage. They'll be blending conference content with art. And at the end of the session, we'll come back to that to use it as a way of summarizing our thoughts and rounding up. So now, to be the first to stick his teeth into what is this big and very interesting issue, I'd like to welcome John Badman, who is an architect specialist in lifestyle-led residential developments and a director at CallisonRTKL. Thank you, John.
Good morning. My name is John Badman. I run the residential team at CallisonRTKL. We're a large mixed-use architects, master planning, interiors and branding company based all around the world, and I've been attending Revo for a long time. It's my first time at Revo, and I specialize in build-to-rent developments across the UK. Wow, that slide clicker, sorry. And I must say, at the start of the year, I wasn't expecting to be stood in front of a group of retail experts offering advice on how to perhaps bring more value to your assets. And likewise, I'm sure you weren't expecting a build-to-rent, self-acclaimed build-to-rent expert to be gracing the stage who would dare to do so. But as Jess has said, we're rightly becoming committed to blurring the lines between sectors and uses. And I hear many messages through our core retail team and across the industry of some of the challenges that you face. The anchors being oversized, the units too small, the units too big, not enough food, decreasing footfall, inward-facing, Amazon eating everything. But as a group and as a property sector, we are all becoming bound by making a place. So it certainly isn't as straightforward as just moving some Lego blocks around on a page or in a three-dimensional model to begin to rethink about repurposing or replanning the retail assets that we work on. And from our side, from the residential side, residents don't just want to live in a shopping centre car park. So what is the right way to navigate our way through these changes? And it's a term that we came up with a while ago to just begin to think about this on a slightly different level. And yes, things are ever changing, but there's a lot that's never changing. So everything is changing and fast. The technology is driving that, and now it's beginning to affect the built assets that we're all designing, developing, that are going to last 50, 60, 100 years, who knows? But the consumer, the shopper, the people who live there, we ourselves are working and living in a very much more agile way. And that brings a little panic, a little fear, and a little indecision. But it's okay. Don't panic, because there are some inherent human needs and desires that we can really begin to bide around and use as a strategy to begin to develop these places. So just a little example of this is that 10,000 years ago, a Homo sapien would go out onto the plain with a spear cut from a sapling, throw it into a boar and drag that back to the fire, cook that meal around the fire, and then eat it with their family, with their community, with their tribe. And today, that still happens. We still sit around Yes, our food may arrive in a different way, on a bike from Deliveroo, or perhaps soon on a drone from a pizza delivery, but that we are still sitting around as a family and as a community in our own modern-day tribes. So those things are never changing. Maslow, the psychologist, has an easier way of beginning to think about this, and that's putting the hierarchy of needs pyramid, which you can see up on the screen. And this brings together those basic human needs at the bottom of the pyramid, those around shelter, rest, food, warmth, and security, and the higher human needs at the top, those that we should all aspire to and think more about when we're bringing these developments forwards. The creativity, the fulfillment, the prestige, and the essence that we're trying to get into our souls and experience from these different places. So how do we do it? First of all, just to touch on a little bit on build to rent, we're involved in a number of developments across the UK. As a practice, we're doing about 30,000 built and operating assets over the last 25 years in multifamily housing in the US. Often with this level of experience and intellect around the subject of build to rent, we're often asked, well, what's the secret? How much amenity? What kind of units? What type of mix? Who are we designing for? And the secret is, there is no secret. It's just simply a lifestyle offer built around like-minded people delivering an operating model, underpinned by great customer service. And I'm sure that's something that you all recognize in your world of retail that you're aiming and striving to do as well. So beginning to think about Maslow's higher human needs and those that we really want to touch on when we're creating these places. And just three things I'm going to touch on quickly now. And that's, first of all, is belonging. And in residential, the location term has been used for many years and is the same in a rental product as it is in a for sale product. People want to belong to a place and to a neighborhood. This is a scheme we're working on at the moment for Lincoln Property at Station Hill outside Reading Station. And yes, we are demolishing an existing shopping centre and replacing that with 1,000 built-to-rent units, 600,000 square foot of office space, new parking, and a whole placemaking strategy around the ground floor with mixed and blurred lines between the retail, the F&B, the co-working. But the initial drawing we did was the one that's in the centre of the page up there, which was about setting up an experience circuit around Reading and belonging to Reading. And as we've moved that forward, we've begun to develop those spaces so people of Reading who live there now and will live there in the future are able to become and have these spaces where they can belong in the town. Connection, human connection. We talk about it a lot. How much effort do we actually put into it? And sometimes, how can the pound sign at the end really begin to reflect on that human connection as well? In our build-to-rent world, we talk a lot about amenity, the amenity arms race, how much, how little, in what place. The secret to it really is to understand the location you're in and the products you're trying to develop. But as we're developing amenity spaces that might be the lounge such as this, which is in Long Harbour's Woolcombe scheme next to High Cross Shopping Centre in Leicester, where, yes, it's a great breakout space for people to have and to be able to share as a community, but as our client in the US, UDR, said a few years ago from some research they put together, a resident is 50% more likely to renew their lease if they know one person in the building, and 90% more likely to renew their lease if they know two or more people in the building. So there is a real business case between creating this human connection and not just thinking it as an ethereal thing that would be a nice to have. And then balancing the uses across the developments and making sure that balance is brought forward in a way that people can understand and find legibility around that development. So yes, we've been involved in a number of schemes across the world of repurposing and replanning shopping centres and bringing in a multitude of different uses. And as the build-to-rent market in the UK's got going, we're talking to many of our clients around the UK about that as well. This is a scheme in Arlington in the US where at Bolston Quarter, which was a pretty traditional shopping centre. We took the ends of the shopping centre off, removed one of the department stores, brought in a large mixed-use, vertical mixed-use building of co-working and rental products, all managed by Forest City. And now that address is much more synonymous with the events that are put on around that space and the residential. And yes, people go shopping there too. At Tyson's Corner, where we covered the entire car parking and service area with a new public plaza between the metro to get direct links into Washington, D.C. And the events which are staged there now are about that community, and Tyson's Corner in itself has become its own community and not just a shopping centre which sat there and was looking like it was on its knees until a few years ago. So in this never changing world, we need to focus hard on those never changing items. And guess what? We talk about experience, about placemaking, about curating, and those are words that we use. They'll be buzzwords now in our industry. But guess what? It's been around for a long, long time. And this is, many of the Greek towns 2,000 years ago would have an agora. And this was a place, the market square, where people would meet and come together to begin to act together and to bring that sense of belonging to the town and to have that political debate, to see craft going on in the corners of the square, to have markets going on, and became the hub and the center of the town. And those higher human needs were led by providing the agora and what people wanted to do within it. So in today's modern lifestyle ecosystem, where people are moving around much more freely, much more agile, they're working in different ways, we're eating in different places, we're getting food in different ways, we're living in a much more agile way, and the build-to-rent market is there to allow people to have that flexibility as well. And the home becomes the anchor at either end of that lifestyle ecosystem. So to finish up, I always kind of look at it as a strategy, and we drive our teams in our office to think not just about the panic and the fear and the indecision that might be brought by the ever-changing world in which we're living, but to think about those higher human needs and about that accomplishment and fulfillment that we're looking to provide in all of the developments we're doing.
Perfect.
Okay?
Perfect. Thank you very much, John. I think you're actually running ahead of time.
Wow, that is rare.
So please take a seat, John. And so alongside John, bringing together, as I said, a diverse range of viewpoints. In fact, I think there's only one kind of typical retail face among them. We have Mark Davy, founder of Futurecity, a global arts, culture, and placemaking consultancy. We have Rebecca Taylor, who is Managing Director of Long Harbour's Build-to-Rent and Multi-Family Division. And we have Justin Taylor, no relation, co-founder of P3, former head of Cushman & Wakefield's EMEA Retail Division, so a familiar face to many of you I know, who's now advising on large, ultra-mixed developments. So next up to the podium, please take us away with your thoughts. Mark.
So we have 5 minutes each, not a lot of time. So I'm going to talk about some big ideas, I hope. Firstly, I think we are looking at big ideas and software, not hardware. Obviously, we're going to talk about buildings, we're going to talk about spaces, but increasingly we're talking about content. And I think one of the most interesting things from our point of view, Futurecity works on large industrial brownfield sites around the world. In London recently, the Greenwich Peninsula with Night Dragon, Wembley Park with Quintain. We're also working with Westfield at White City. So we've been responsible for some big thinking on big developments. We've been in at very early stages. So I have some observations about the world. The first thing is that cities are becoming more important than countries, that the cities are beginning to compete with other cities. So whether it's Melbourne to Sydney, or it's Liverpool to Manchester, or it's London to New York, cities are competing with other cities. Interestingly, what that's done is created the idea of an independent identity for each of those cities and large towns. And if you sub down into that, you look at creative districts, downtowns, and they're all using culture and creativity as a differentiator. So something that was once nothing to do with us, it was something that someone else did. Art was something that happened maybe through a 106 or whatever. Culture, the arts, has become hugely important. It allows a city, allows a place to define their identity. Now, interestingly, that's then broken down into the business sector that I think has finally woken up to the idea that they get culture. Culture makes money, culture attracts footfall, culture creates identity. So it's kind of interesting that in a creative economy, which is what we basically are now, we're a creative economy. We're selling ideas, IP, ideas and experience. So we shouldn't be surprised that the consumer is now interested in that, and they want more than, as we're seeing, just the experience of the past. They're looking for ideas around whether it's footfall, whether it's social media, whether it's planning, whether it's brand loyalty. The value of culture is becoming more and more relevant to our decision making. And certainly with the big developers that we've worked on, not just in the UK, but also in Australia, Middle East, and in America, the idea now of culture is becoming such an important part of their planning, and they're beginning to understand that they want to merge. For instance, I'll give you an example. The commercial sector wants what the residential sector wants. The residential sector wants the leisure things. The leisure sector want the commercial. They're all beginning to coalesce and come together. They want basically a kind of self-contained experience where everything is happening in one place. So this completely applies to the retail sector, because effectively that theatricality that you've got to start planning for is completely relevant to the big shopping malls and out-of-town centres. So there are opportunities in the middle of bad news for some pretty extraordinary things. The other big observation I would make is that brands are also going down this line. So what they're beginning to look at is the kind of black box idea of a space in which amazing things happen. So whether it's Nike working with filmmakers, artists, artisans, designers, creating experiences that create brand loyalty, even if that brand loyalty means buying off the internet, effectively that's how they're starting to thinking about that creativity. So I'm going to start the film. Let's see. So what I want to do is show you some artists that are working in this sector. So what's beginning to happen is that gradually artists and organizations are starting to be aware of this market and leaving the gallery and leaving the public sector kind of cultural ownership and starting to come outside. So this is Team Lab. Their new museum in Tokyo is the biggest attractor for a single artist museum in the world. The numbers are amazing. I think it's attracted 2.3 million visitors in 1 year. It's a privately run, private sectoral business. What they're doing is an immersive experience. There are no objects, there are no products. You go inside the building and extraordinary things happen. So what we're beginning to see now, the example on the screen, for instance, where you're able to send a message to the artwork and the artwork changes. If with some of our clients we're able to get in early, we're beginning to think about the buildings in a different way. We're beginning to think about the spaces, the infrastructure, the architecture, the landscaping. All of these things can now be adapted so that artworks become part of them. They're not just kind of something that lands later on. So this is Kohei Nawa, another Japanese artist, creating these incredible foam landscapes. This is Mikhail Rovner's piece for Chanel. So again, understanding the consumer, understanding the brand changes, understanding the use of the space in which all these things happen, do create incredible opportunities. At the same time, in the public sector, there is a sense now that they have got to start to partner with the private sector. So we're beginning to see now, we recently worked in London for Ballymore, where the English National Ballet have moved to a new building on Ballymore's residential site. So this has become an anchor arts partner inside a residential development. It's brought with it huge brand values, huge amounts of PR and marketing, and of course it's created uplift in terms of the values of the apartments and rental there as well. So it's the way to see this really is the new audiences that we all want are hungry for experience. They want these things. All of these artists are working in the private sector. They're working collaboratively with other disciplines, whether that's architects, landscape architects, or with developers. And the new, more sort of, I would say, the younger, more urban savvy developers and investors that we're working with are beginning to really understand how this can benefit them. This is a prototype for a big sculpture that's gone into the Albert Embankment, but what we were able to do with it was not just put it into the landscape, but also create events in which we had investors come to see, in this case, the ballet dancers working against that image. This, if you've seen the Rain Room, you've been lucky enough to experience it, 7-hour queues around the world to get into this space, in which perpetual rain stops when you stand underneath it. So that basically it tracks you and stops the rain wherever you are. In Melbourne, a permanent rain room has just gone in, 6-7-hour queues trying to get in. A ticketed arts event. So these, again, are new experiences. This is all new language. And we're all at the beginning of this, which is a very kind of unusual area. But it takes courage and it takes challenge. And I'm always saying to clients, you know, if you've got the ability to borrow huge amounts of money to do a huge physical kind of interventions in the landscape, surely you've got the same imagination to be able to do something like this. This is Leo Villarreal, who you will have seen, one of the projects we won recently was the bridges along the Thames, which are all being lit by one artist, the largest artwork in the world. That was originally an architectural project, and it's now become a public arts project. So I guess what's kind of interesting is these artists that we're working with are beginning to see incredible opportunities. This is Studio Swine, who've been working with Cord recently. This is the Eden project. This huge piece of sculpture emits from 30-point smoke rings, which are scented to smell of different extinction periods. They're working with scientists, scent makers, and technologists to create this incredible opportunity. And this project is at T2 at Heathrow. What you're looking at is effectively the landscape budget for the new terminal, in which we were able to convince them to flip that budget to become a cultural project instead. This has become this huge, largest sculpture in Europe, effectively running off these huge columns as you go into T2. And it's a plane effectively in flight tumbling through the space. It's hit all sorts of targets: global PR, huge footfall, social media impact, and of course it's using budgets that are in the system. This is not an art budget that was set aside. This was a budget to actually build T2, and we were able to get in early enough to flip it. And most of the projects we're involved in now, especially those at very early stage, are trying to convince our clients to think in highly creative ways around areas that they wouldn't have thought had any kind of cultural opportunity. And this with Matt Collishaw, again, an amazing British artist working on this, using almost Victorian technology to create this extraordinary sculpture, which kind of looks as though it's three-dimensional, but effectively is a sort of zoetrope spinning. So what I suppose I would to sum up in my 5 minutes is there's a real opportunity, I think, within the retail sector to start thinking about the theatricality, the circus ring opportunities that are there. There's real opportunities to think about partnerships, and there's real opportunities to work with amazing creative people who are desperate to work in this sector and are not bringing with them, if you like, the baggage of, I guess, the kind of the arts world that we would have known. There's new audiences and there's new relationships emerging. And with Callison, for instance, we're working with them quite closely to look at very, very creative art and architecture, art and infrastructure ideas. But it's also about business. It brings with it, as I say, the things you need: audience, footfall, attractors, and so on. And say to finish, this is I can't remember the name of the artist, but it's an amazing interactive work that's just been opened in London. So thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Mark. And now introduce up to the podium Rebecca Taylor.
I'm not sure really how I'm going to follow that with some boring build-to-rent talk, but I'll try my hardest. John spoke before quite a lot about build-to-rent, and I'm quite conscious that in this audience, people will probably may have heard the buzzword but have no idea what build-to-rent actually is. So I thought I'd take a bit of a step back and explain the principles, the opportunity that we're seeing in the market today, and then talk about actually how we're approaching residential differently to deliver, picking up on everybody's side of things in terms of the culture and the experience and that side of things. So if you think about the traditional UK property market, we've always been very segregated. Residential, commercial, retail specialists in the room, industrial, everybody is kind of stuck in their lane. And then you dive down then deeper into that, and in the residential market, it further gets redefined into social, your traditional build to sell, which has always been dominated by the top 10 house builders in the UK. And then more recently, the private rented sector, or PRS. Now, actually, PRS is not a new concept. People have been renting homes. We were talking before about their grandparents probably still rented their house, but their parents were the first ones to actually own their homes. So we're starting to see a resurgence of the private rented sector, and it's not just driven by a lack of affordability, but it's also being driven by experience. And within that PRS sector, it's really clear to define the different product types that have emerged over the last couple of years. You've got your traditional buy-to-let landlords, which I'm sure some of you have investment properties in the room. You've got your student accommodation. Driving around Liverpool yesterday, everybody's talking to me about how many students there are, and you can see all the buildings up and about. And then you've got this build-to-rent sector. So at the moment, Savills have said that the residential market in the UK is valued above £7 trillion. Of that, 21% of that is PRS. And we've actually seen that grow quite significantly in the last couple of years, 4% just in the last 5 years. People are renting for longer, there's an undersupplied market, but actually it's a choice side of things. We were talking last night, I've rented the same flat for 10 years. Yes, I work in property and I don't own my own flat. But for me, it's more about the location, the experience, and actually the flexibility that I have about renting a place. And so we're expected to see that to grow quite significantly, even just in the short term. The year-on-year projections show the private rented sector is going to grow at least 33% over the next couple of years. And as you see Brexit and other market factors come through, you're really starting to see build to rent and different product offerings being able to actually deliver product and sort of prove the investment case as well as the customer experience. One key thing to kind of pull out is that in the US, actually 47% of the private rented sector, multifamily as it's called over there, is actually owned by institutional investors. They control the market. In the UK commercial world, actually 55% of the market is controlled by institutional markets. But in the residential world, only 3% of that market is controlled by institutions. At the moment, it's dominated by mums and pops and buy-to-let landlords who own less than 5 properties. And this is where we're seeing the change. They weren't focused on service, they were focused on income and collecting their rent and offsetting their tax side of things. And the institutional investment now, if you overlay what's happening in the US or what's happened in the US the last 20 years, if you even compare it to the commercial market, actually, and transpose that onto the residential market, you see that the investment appetite or potential for the residential sector is over £660 billion. Now that's on the current value of the current residential market, assuming we didn't build anything else. So this actually creates a huge opportunity from an investment side of things. We recently raised our 3rd fund in the sector, first time from global investors, and we saw this appetite come through for those who actually have experience in delivering product and managing the product in the sector. But I think coming back to the whole experiential thing, why do we care about it in build to rent? Well, it's a much more liquid market. If you think you used to sell somebody their house, they've saved for a long time, it's really hard to sell your house, it's quite an illiquid asset. People will put up with certain things. You buy an apartment, you can hear the people walking around upstairs. It's quite hard to put your property back on the market, sell it again and exit. As a renter, you'll serve your notice and move out pretty much there and then. So what we've started to look at is the affordability, the type of I'm sure you guys all do this all the time. We look at this top-down approach, so what are the macroeconomic factors? At the moment, there's a misnomer that everybody in the private rented sector is all the millennials and the kind of Generation Z who can't afford to get onto the property ladder. But actually, we start to look at the tenant breakups in different locations. We do this in each of our schemes. And then we try and interpret into actually what the personalities of those people are, or the tribes, I suppose, that John was talking to before. So the key trends that those people, you don't go to there's a mix of ages and groups and everything in this room at the moment. How boring if you all lived in the same building where everyone was 21 to 25 and earned 20 grand a year. It's not the way we live as humans. So we try and figure out this way of, the key trends that go on, and really trying to put a face to that data. Who are the people that we're designing buildings for? Who are the people that are going to be living in the buildings for? And then what does this mean in terms of how we interact with the commercial, the office, and so on and so forth? So this is actually something that we just recently did in Tottenham, a scheme that's just started construction. We sent Callison there, we sent our team there, and we all spent time in the local area figuring out what was going on. You get off the tube in Tottenham, and it looks like low-level industrial with not much going on. And you start to open up the canvas a little bit, and you see there's a climbing centre there. And you start to talk to the people in the location, and they were living in Shoreditch. They've relocated to Tottenham, and they really don't want gentrification to be hitting them. They like the local connection. They grow their own food. There's a local wine store who's linked with a local cheese store. But each person in that location, Louis, 38, he's got a different, he's from Spain, he's an architect, and he loves the green spaces of Tottenham. Toby, he's 34, he's a bit younger, but he's really much more focused on the kind of activity of the climbing centre, and really understanding how people use the space in that current location can then inform you how you design spaces for the longer term, and attracting people. And I think keeping people at the heart of what you do, local people, and also attracting new people is kind of key to what we're trying to do for the sector. And this then interprets into how we design our buildings, so not just the spaces, but the experiences that happen in there, the interior design side of things, really trying to target into those kind of people. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago, and he organizes festivals. And he said the best thing about a festival is actually infrastructure, coming back to those basic human needs. People need water, they need food, they need somewhere to sleep, and hopefully somewhere to shower, depending on what level of experience you've paid for. But you think about Glastonbury. Glastonbury is, people go there for the music, but everybody in Glastonbury has a different experience. whether they've been to see Fleetwood Mac or Kylie Minogue, or they've eaten a doner kebab or partied at 5 o'clock in the morning, the common thread that these people have and the canvas that's created from that one location is less about the fact that I went and saw Kylie Minogue and loved her, and more about how awesome was Glastonbury this year. I had my own experience with, different friend groups, and it's something that kind of combines people. And I think that's where we need to start thinking about for the property industry, not defining what people do in a space, but giving them the opportunity to move around in the space and have their own experiences. Again, this is back to Beryl Yard. So we're picking up on kind of key people and how what their interactions are, the journeys and the spaces. And the reason is because we're trying to create, a real hub and a real home for, this is Beryl Yard, it's an old pencil factory in Tottenham. So the key denominator here is that all these people have different experiences and journeys, but they all connect back at one spot. And I think that's one way that we should start, where we're starting to think about, product offering, design, and we're doing it crudely because obviously it helps retention. People stay longer. John had that statistic before about if you know one person in the building, you're 50% more longer to stay, or a bit more likely to stay. Where churn is terrible for us, just like it is for you. We want to keep people for longer. We need to keep their attention for longer. And as a long-term investor, that's why these are important in terms of looking back at the experience and designing spaces that will enable an evolution of whatever's going on in that place at the moment. So I think coming back to us, we mentioned this is the scheme in Leicester at the moment. It's a nicely designed kitchen which goes out onto a rooftop. We only just opened this in August of this year. Our first customer to move in was 55. The average tenant age in this building is 32, even though we do have quite a big student population. This is the first residential building that's been built in Leicester above 50 units ever, because the capital values were not there, so student accommodation was there. But what we're seeing is this real demand for people who, so our let-up rate was 22 units a month. We've already let 170 units in 6 weeks. With people moving in. And the point is it's about, for them, affordability. They can't believe that they're getting all of this for, as part of their space. Some people will enjoy the space, some people won't. But really for them, it's a really changed perception and a new way of life. And so for us, this is really what we're trying to forward. We want to work with different developers and retailers and office developers as well in trying to create these real communities. And I know that's really overused kind of word, but I think it's essential when we are, starting from the top down and bottom up as well. So, thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Rebecca. And now take us away, Justin, kind of bringing all these threads together for the retail sector.
So, whilst planning for the future, I think it's also useful to take a look back as well, quickly, a little bit of the past. And learn from that experience. You need to look no further than what's going on in the US right now, and that image on the screen will be quite familiar to a number of you. Shopping centres only developed relatively short period of time ago, already obsolete. Compare that with the ever-enduring Grand Bazaar at Istanbul, which many of you will have visited. They started construction around 1450, which was the period of the Ottoman Empire. But if you think about that endurance and why, right from the outset, the place had a purpose, and it was about stimulating growth in that city. It was part of a global trade route, and it also offered security. It was a walled city, effectively. And it was a great place, and wherever I've been in the world, the correlation between great architecture and great retail is always very, very obvious. And the Grand Bazaar also has something else. It has people, and there's nothing like people to attract more people. And today it has something like 90 million visitors a year. So I want to briefly talk about 5 themes which I believe will shape what consumers want in the future. I actually believe this so strongly, I've just formed a new business based around these principles, and also tie together what colleagues on the panel have already talked about. First, people, and people has been a recurring theme, as you've heard already this morning. And when I talk about people, I include within this both customers and the occupier, and an absolutely forensic focus in what we do about who is the customer and who is the occupier has never been more important than it is now. So, quick reminder, we must do our research, and we must do it really, really well, and go back to that very sort of simple question, who are we making this place for, and make it very relevant to that audience. And there's some examples up on the screen, some London examples of some of those places. But it's about building a community and not a building. And increasingly, occupiers talk about their community for their business, for their brand. And we must not lose sight of that. Culture has come up a lot this morning as well, and also what's the place for? And part of that is about having fun, leisure, entertainment. Secondly, purpose, and for me, this is one of the biggest points that I'd really like to make this morning, and I think again has come up already. But this simple question: what is the purpose of this place? And I think very often this is actually either forgotten about or gets lost in translation along the journey. And if you think about Liverpool 1, I think is a fantastic example, not only in terms of, I think still it's one of the best benchmarks of regeneration in Europe, but it was more than that. And I think the social benefit to the city has been absolutely enormous. And then you think about these other examples, they have real purpose. So insight, why are we developing this place? And think about life sciences, knowledge clusters, entrepreneurship, innovation. What is it? What's the purpose behind the development? And stay true to that. I think it's also important, going back to the customer, is what's in it for them? What's the benefit to the individual? What's the experience going to be? Much overused word, but very important. We then get to the property solution, the place design. I'm involved with Edinburgh St James, I think a fabulous example of mixed use, which is where the market is moving to, sort of away, if you like, from the shopping centre to a new model. Includes a lot of residential, which we've talked about, hotel, and just lots of things to do apart from and in addition to shopping. But the purpose is really defined, as I say, and that's an input. Placemaking, to me, is an output. And again, very topical word in the property sector, but that is really about the creation of public and community spaces. And I think that's very different from the purpose of the place. And you've heard already this morning, again, I think this point about the emotional connection with people, building memories with them, those are the things which will encourage people to return. Ongoing engagement, I think this is hugely important from what consumers are going to want going forward. So ongoing action to support the purpose. So the shopping centre sector has become a very tradable asset class, in, out, make money, so on and so forth. But that isn't really the model that we need to have going forward. And I think we need a broader view on planning. We've talked a little bit this morning, but I think it'd be good to develop that in the question about space. I don't mean space up there, but I mean how does an occupier want to use space? And I think increasingly a brand wants to do lots and lots of things in a space, which other than just selling things. So I think our planning use system is restricted. I think we'll need greater flexibility around asset management. And I think leasing structures, again, I would challenge myself, challenge everyone. We need more flexibility around leasing structures. And then finally, leadership. Every great project needs great leadership. It needs great vision. But I think social responsibility has also never been more important. The role of the landlord is changing. It's going to be about developing and delivering to a customer base, not just a focus on an investment income. And I think this point about biophilic design is going to become increasingly important. So this connection between humans and nature. And you can see some great examples here in the HQ of Apple in Cupertino and at Changi Airport in Singapore. So I think some threads there, some quick fire threads that feed through everything that's been talked about already this morning, but I think will help to shape some thinking around what customers want in the future.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Justin. I'll take the clicker. Thank you. So first off, a question from me, but get your thinking caps on in terms of questions you might like to ask to the panel. So kicking off, Justin, you mentioned first off flexibility, and both Mark and Rebecca, you talked about culture, you've talked about activation, you've talked about, again, those spaces being flexible enough to accommodate a variety of community needs. So this question is just all about that flexibility. It's not necessarily something that bricks and mortar as a medium is associated with, and flexibility is not something, as Justin touched on, that the property sector is necessarily known to be good at and moving very, very quickly with that change. I mean, from your point of view as an architect, John, what can we do as a sector to kind of ensure we're catching the crest of that wave?
So when we're looking at flexibility and how to, is that working? When we're looking at flexibility and how we're looking to bring that into a development, and from direct experiences on some of the build to rent that we're looking at around the country, we're often talking about those ground floors, that ground floor activation, that lobby, and we really find that if the client has a plan and they stick to it, the flexibility can be built in. If the client has a plan which maybe has a plan B that they revert to halfway through designing it, that causes a few problems. So, for example, with Lincoln at Reading at the moment, the whole of that ground floor is completely flexible. And if a 10,000 square foot retail offer comes in that is going to add to the sense of place of that development, then great. But that building is not going to be there for another 3 years. And if that needs to be smaller, more independent retail units along the edges of that new street that we're creating, then great as well. But we've designed the flexibility in there so that we can bring the right partners for creating the place to support the residential offer above, rather than just taking whatever lease can be found.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Rebecca, you mentioned those kind of more, pop-up festivals. It's just those kind of basic human needs in a field, and you allow everyone to have the fun that they want. But how do you take that kind of atmosphere into your build-to-rent buildings?
I mean, fundamentally, we're not living any different. So we all need to sleep, we all need to eat. We need a kitchen and a lounge room, and some people need 2 lounge rooms and a bigger wardrobe, or whichever. But ultimately, those spaces on how we live in the flat themselves fundamentally haven't changed for a really long time, and I'm not sure they're going to change drastically. What we focus on, though, is actually how people get into their flat, because the flat should be their sanctuary. It should be the place that they go for quiet time, that they kind of, can recharge. And, we're all about these community experiences, but sometimes you just need to switch off. So, that's a core thing of just the residential, the units themselves. But then we have to think about, well, how do people move in and move out of those flats? Because they're moving in and out quicker. How do the ground floor translate with the current community? And it shouldn't be just, a couple of residential towers on top of a shopping block and job done. It should be that, people can walk past a space and go, what is that? I'm going to just pop in there and have a cup of coffee. You think about the Hoxton hotels or the Ace hotels, they're really great at activating space on the ground floor and changing those spaces quickly depending on how people are using the spaces. And you go to the Ace hotel in Hoxton Hotel, and people will be sitting on the bag kind of carrier, kind of on their laptops, kind of typing, because there's not enough space in there. And so for us, I think it's more about making giving the shell at the bottom where it's an experience that people come into for a reason, but actually in the long term that it could change from the art installation to the coffee shop to the bar, or whatever's actually the people in that building want to achieve in that time. So that's what we're looking for. That's why we look at the people first, and then kind of activate the ground floors from there.
Thank you. And Mark, that chimes in with what you're very passionate about bringing those arts and culture to these spaces. But in order to enable more of those wonderful works we saw in your video, what more would you like to see from the property and the retail sector?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example, I think, of somewhere that's worth looking at and visiting is Wembley Park, the Quintain development. When we started working with the guys there, it was interesting that originally it was obviously it's the big PRS scheme. You've already got the Wembley Stadium as a sort of backdrop. But what is the place? And it's suburbia. When, Brent is suburban, but this is an urban product. So what we were able to do with the team there was to start questioning almost everything that was being invested in. And the very quick example would be the Olympic Way. If you've walked to the Olympic Way from the station and gone into the stadium, that's an iconic routeway. Well, I remember very early on there was an RFP going out for the upgrade of that of the Olympic Way, but it was very much a landscape idea. And what we managed to do is work with them to think of this as a cultural experience. So suddenly plug and play, load-bearing points, sound audio points in the lamppost all the way along, digital banners, the ability to do big. So suddenly what was a problem, which was getting these huge numbers out of the stadium very, very quickly, became an asset, this huge space, multifunctional. And once the brand was then start clear on what that space could be, you could then work to the sides. So they've invested in theatres, they've invested in Box Park, they've created JVs, so they've started to make their own culture. So I think it's within our grasp, because often some of the assets that we would see as not having cultural or creative value actually have a lot, and that's where the money is. And I remember when we first started in the business, we were very much thinking, well, we'll go in and say what we think you should do and how much you should pay. And what we realized, what we had to do was to smuggle it in on the back of assets that were already in the system. So I think it's about this, again, it's about creating the theatre or the circus ring inside which things can happen. You don't have to actually do it. Others will do it for you, but they'll come to you if you're offering an authentic experience or context.
Thank you. And Justin, you've already touched on a little bit about what, from a property perspective, that flexibility could look like, overhaul of use classes, more flexible leases. So are we starting to see a move in the right direction, do you think, to enable this blended world?
I think the move has definitely come from the occupier, whether it's hotels, what residents want in apartments, whether it's retail brands. What they're looking for is space within which they can project their brand in the right way, and co-working is another really good example. So many things. Is it a shop? Is it somewhere you stay? Is it a restaurant? So we're going to have to ultimately respond to the occupier. At the moment, and planning is a very complex subject, but I think planning is. There are very many positives about planning, but it's a long process and it can be quite restrictive. So I think there are some challenges around that. And I think leasing models, they are changing already, but they will need to change faster to allow flexibility to create change. And the customer wants a different experience all of the time. So if we don't do it, they will choose to go somewhere that does do it. Mm-hmm. And so they will literally vote with their feet. So kind of the property sector will have to get with that. So I think the business model is going to change as well.
That's where it's interesting with us, because we just get amenity on the planning on the ground floor, and we can figure out when we, 6 months prior to launch, what we're actually going to put in there. When you're building retail spaces, there's 16 different use classes or something, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And so you're defining from the very outset that this is going to be an A1 or a D1 or a D2 sort of space. And that's probably where the planning side of things needs to play. I mean, at the moment, we've got the flexibility where we can just aim it as amenity, and whether it becomes an art gallery or a coffee shop or whichever, we'll figure it out at the end. And not the end, but you know what I mean. We'll figure it out and respond to what people are asking for, rather than it's quite defined, stick in your lane.
And sorry, and I think very quickly, I think the other point is increasingly that there's a real recognition that if you get the ground floor plane right in terms of that mix of uses, it then creates additional value for what's going on above, be that residential, be that offices. It encourages, it makes employment easier in the office sector if you've got something going on which is really interesting at ground floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, again, taking a bigger view. If you look at in London, it's quite interesting looking at the competition at the moment between Canary Wharf and what they're doing with Wood Wharf, what's happening with King's Cross, what's happening at Wembley, what's happening at the Greenwich Peninsula, out at Stratford, out to the edges of London to places like Croydon, and they're beginning increasingly to offer these almost self-contained creative district structures. And what they're looking for, of course, is multi-use theatre alongside resi, alongside commercial, alongside tech, and so on. All I see in the UK, whether it's Nottingham where we're working at the moment, or London, or out in Australia where we're doing a number of projects, is mixed use, with all the different disciplines starting to kind of combine to create something much more hybrid.
And I'd just add that to touch back to Justin and Bex on the planning side, everything in planning is generally quantitative. It's X thousand square foot of X use class, and trying to pin that down is because they're trying not to get screwed over. But there's nothing qualitative about the decisions and the trust that they need to put into. This is a room full of fantastic developers and people who aren't going to screw over the planning system. The objective is to make something great, and to be able to judge the qualitative nature of what we're trying to submit on day one that might not be realised until day 3, as Bex has said about, we don't know what is the best bike maintenance team going to come into that ground floor shop, or is it going to be an art gallery? Do you know what? We just don't know, but we have a vision and an objective for that place to be great. So we need some trying to get that in. And I mean, I've worked with many planning authorities that do. When you go through the process with them, they get it and they understand it. And often how those authorities work is often perhaps the same case officer isn't there 3 years on, where the same client and the same design team often still are. So that continuity sometimes needs to continue further.
Thank you. Good opportunity. Does anyone have a question from the floor? Please put your hand up very high, because visibility is not brilliant. Did you just spot
Middle
one?
at the back.
Middle at the back, I believe. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Christine Murray from The Developer. I wanted to ask about social exclusion that can be inherent in a culture approach that you're talking about. So if we're talking about inclusive communities, the culture is a word also that's used to exclude demographics that are seen as less attractive, who maybe aren't interested in coffee or co-working or wine and cheese. And when we're talking about communities like Tottenham, it's especially important, I think. We also have loneliness and health and suicide epidemics. So that idea of connection and community being increasingly important to councils who want to promote the health and well-being of the whole community, not just perhaps the most appealing 1%. I wondered whether you guys could speak to that idea of inclusion beyond the attractive consumer, and then also whether, with research showing that happiness is often about what we do for others as opposed to what we have, is there a room for placemaking to allow communities to contribute to the making of places in a meaningful way and perhaps give to the place and to each other?
Thank you. Big question there then. How can design have really comprehensive social inclusion, and also how can we create spaces that the communities actually feel like they're really helping to evolve those? I don't know. Yeah, John, if you'd like to kick off.
So, I totally agree. First of all, we need to have inclusive, sustainable, long-term communities which are grounded in the place that they are, that are accessible and usable by everybody. We've talked a little bit about demographics and about creating personalities for the developments that we might be presenting. However, I can tell you when the door opens, all that is just off the table. It's about who wants to live in that lifestyle that we might have presented to people. We've been involved in a number of schemes where we're talking with the local community and involving them heavily in the design process. And one of the challenges of that is that they might not necessarily understand what the brief is. So our brief and that community involvement based on a land value of a piece of land that's been bought with a development with a viability model sat behind it is not the sort of conversation you open with in a public consultation meeting. But I think there's a way that could be brought together much more closely, and they could understand what we're trying to do and how we're trying to include everybody in that conversation. And I think we go back to the flexibility point of this, is that the community uses in a lot of the stuff we're working on are not just in that space over there because that's the lowest value. Those community uses are becoming the heart of those developments often because they are more highly used. We want to involve and include people as much as possible through all hours of the day in as many parts of the development as possible.
And yeah, Mark, your thoughts on this? Because sometimes I think people can see the arts as quite an exclusive thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's that term culture washing or art washing, where you put something at the front of a building and it supposedly tricks the planners into giving you an uplift or makes it's rubbish, really. I mean, we're in really interesting times. The community has become more important, and the systems that developers use are becoming redundant and not working. So when I first started 11 years ago, and I went to my first big sort of property meeting, you had architect, landscape architect, engineer, transport consultant, so on. There was that team. And in a sense, the product was made, it was marketed and sold. It just doesn't work like that anymore. So the world has changed beyond all recognition. And the good news is that the system of delivering real estate is having to change and adapt. And some of the more, as I was saying earlier, urban savvy, younger developers, I think, are much more aware of that. And the market's changed, as we were saying, it's a much more mixed-use market. So that's important. The other big area that I think is coming through, we're involved in quite heavily at the moment, is co-creation and co-design. And that's actually allowing, that's the wrong word, actually encouraging the consultation with the community to be part of the design, almost as the client. And we have one big project in London, which is quite exciting, where that's going to be quite a major part of it. So the language, thankfully, is changing. But culture just means it's everything. It's not art. Culture is food, it's sport, it's life. So it's about and we've got big issues to deal with at the moment, haven't we, with climate and so on. So I think what's happened is everything seems to be swirling around. And I think there's an intelligence now that just says, we've all got to be part of this together. We can't just have the old systems delivering product which then no one wants or doesn't want to live or work in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just quick thoughts from you both, and then we'll have time for another question. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, so we're focused on affordability. Build to rent at the moment has a bad reputation, I think, or it has the opportunity to be bad, on that everyone's focused on this premium rent. If you give all these amenities in this commercial thing, people will pay more. Well, actually, that's a very short-sighted view. So we look on a long-term, at least a 20-year investment horizon, much like you do in the retail world or the shopping centre world. So we want to be able to make sure that people are coming to that building, one, because they can afford it, because that's a key driver of people in the market, but two, because they like the experience and how we've kind of positioned it. So I think that part about inclusion and coming back to planning side of things, even in build to rent at the moment, we're having some debates in the market about discount to market rent and how it should be managed by a social landlord, and therefore people need a separate door. And you think, well, that is the definition of exclusion. I'd like to be able to charge rents at a level that the market sets, because frankly, we're a commodity now, but then not be able to offer everybody in that building the same experiences. So whether you're paying £200 a month or £1,000 a month, that's what makes a diverse community. And about ages, as I said before, it's not about young professionals who can't get on the property ladder. Urbanization, you've got people selling up their homes and wanting to come back into city centres and be part of the community, they're the pieces about when we're trying to create a culture and not force a culture on people, but allow the creation or the canvas to kind of bleed out itself, rather than, again, being kind of quite monolithic on what our thoughts are and how you should live your life. I think that's, the other way around. So we're even using things like apps, like Olio, which is an app that you can go onto, and we just put it on our portal, but basically you can go onto there. If you've got excess food, you can say, I've got a loaf of bread and some bananas and I'm going away, anybody want them? And people can just come pick them up from your door, or you can, that's another way to go into the community. So being able to allow a platform, a bit like an Apple phone does with different apps on it, that people can plug into, I think that's also about what property and community needs to start to be like.
Mm-hmm. Justin?
Yeah, I think we've covered it, but I think success will increasingly be judged by being relevant to the community that you're developing in and working with, and that community needs to be part of the process. Ultimately, you're delivering for that community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do we have another question in the audience? No, that's fine. I just wanted to pick up on that. Fabulous. Microphone coming to you.
Hello everyone, Guy Shearer at SPG. The property industry in the UK has been very slow to react to the changes taking place, so it's been very refreshing to hear 4 people on the panel, 5, coming up with new ideas and looking forward to the future. I have one simple question for Rebecca, which you partly answered a moment ago by referring to 20 years as an investment. But what kind of returns are your investors looking for?
They're looking for a yield, like you are in
And
the
the
shopping
market
sector.
generally, as well as long haul.
Yeah, I mean, there's a spread at the moment, so they're starting to look a lot more like US returns in terms of there's a maturity in the investment market, but not in the product, which is slightly the wrong way around. But we're looking for a yield of kind of like 4.25% on an annual basis, and others are kind of being able to go down to kind of maybe 3.5 in terms of cap rates, and it varies depending on sector and kind of the product type. I think at the moment you haven't seen the maturation of the sector, you haven't seen assets properly trading, because we're only just starting to build this stuff. Wembley's latter phases are only just opening this year, so we'll start to see that probably move out a little bit as stock starts to come back on the market, and then you'll start to see yields hardening again as well. But they're not the 20% profit on cost plus returns that the kind of develop to sell people were looking at before. And as I said, that comes back into the longevity of the cash and why we're focused on customer service and not just how shiny is your kitchen and how quickly can we flip it. So.
Thank you. So to kind of tie up some of these threads, just a few words from all of you, starting with Justin. What do future consumers want from place?
To me, as I mentioned earlier, I think moving forward, I think purpose is going to be the key ingredient. So what is this place for? What's the relevance of it to the consumer, and how can they engage with it? And I think everybody, all of us, are looking for that sort of engagement in places that we visit, and that's the more engagement we get, that's why we go back. And you can monetize that.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I think freedom, actually. I think everyone's been told what to do for a very long time, and we're now seeing, going back to kind of the grassroots of side of things. So I think as I said, being able to provide a canvas that will allow people to do that, but that does have a purpose, I think, as well. You can't just free for all. No one will be interested. So I think, but yeah, having the freedom to breathe and kind of think for themselves.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, again, I just think it's all about it's the feeling that what you're experiencing is your own. So either you've shared it with a group, like you were talking about, someone was talking earlier about Glastonbury, that shared experience, but there's also that sense that I think I saw something that was different. So for me, it's about independence, and it's experience, and it's about identity. And again, I would just say what fits nicely now is that what's important is that Liverpool looks like Liverpool and Leicester looks like Leicester, and drawing out those places and making them unique is a real great opportunity for people. So independence and identity, authenticity, all these words we keep hearing are relevant.
Thank you. John?
So for me, ultimately, it's like people do want these places, so please can we get them built? First of all, we can stand around and talk about it for a long time. Getting it built and getting products out there is the most important thing. And that product, for me, simply is what do people want from place? They want what they've always wanted. They want to be happy, they want to belong, they want to be fulfilled. And those are words which perhaps in the property industry we should just use a little bit more.
Thank you. And we can see on the screen now we've got the ever-evolving work from Scriberia, which looks brilliant, picking up on some of the themes that we've touched on. So the hierarchy of needs, that it's really important for communities to be connected and to feel fulfilled, and really linking into that lifestyle. But there's a combination here which I think you've all brought together wonderfully, that dynamic between the property, the kind of the solid environment in which we live in, but the fact that those places need to be theatres for the festivals, for the communities, for those kind of authentic experiences, all of these brilliant words that we've heard through the session today. And I hope you guys all have your own wonderful, authentic experiences at Revo. That's our ever and never changing session all wrapped up. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.